Day 3, panel 2. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon as we embark on a very critical discussion with a host of lovely, lovely folks. We've had 2.5 full days of programming, and we're excited for this afternoon session as well. My name is Anna-Rita Mores, and I'm the chair for the School of Design at George Brown College. I'm excited to welcome all of you to today's panel discussion entitled Design at the Intersection of Accessibility and Inclusion, which means many, many things to many, many different people. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that George Brown College is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and other Indigenous people who have lived here over time. We're grateful to share this land as treaty people who learn, work, and live in a community with each other. Across the School of Design, we remain committed to identifying and removing systemic barriers to accessing college programs and services, and are committed to working towards strategies, tools, and actions to better support our Indigenous student population. Now, to be meaningful and inclusive, accessibility must underpin all of the work and processes of a designer. But where do we start? The truth is that inclusive design is just better design. As designers, we play a critical role in providing experiences that are more navigable, whether 2- or 3-dimensional. What is the role that design education plays and needs to continue to play in designing a more accessible landscape? This afternoon, we'll use today's panel discussion to identify the ways in which accessible design has the power to improve the lives of all of its users. We'll get an inside look into our panelists' experience with accessibility and design, and discuss projects with triumphs, challenges, barriers, and opportunities in accessible design. We would like for today's panel to be as interactive and dynamic as possible, and thus we have brought together industry members, faculty, and design students alike. We encourage you as the audience member to ask questions to our panel and share your own experiences with accessibility in the chat. Now with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to all of our panelists this afternoon rather. With a passion for design, accessibility, and user research, Janice has made a career as a designer, educator, and a local guest speaker. Her talks were hosted at local events such as WordCamp and the RGD. She's a double alumni of George Brown College, holding an advanced diploma in the graphic design program from the class of 2005 and the career development practitioner postgraduate certificate from 2021. She fell into becoming an accessibility subject matter expert in 2014 while working at Metroland, and has since worked in several roles at the intersection of accessibility and design. Welcome, Janice. Edmund Lee is a creative director with over 25 years of experience designing interpretive and wayfinding signage, exhibits, donor recognition, and interactivity around the world. Creating experiences that are accessible to all is an important aspect of his design philosophy. This is reflected in his choices of type, color, contrast, and message delivery techniques in his projects. Edmund is an advocate of accessibility and the co-author of Accessibility to a Practical Handbook on Accessible Graphic Design. Welcome, Edmund. We have Chris Lange joining us, who is an independent designer currently pursuing an MFA in graphic design at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. His current focus is exploring how open source tools, libraries, and languages can provide relief from monopolized web, while increasing our ability to access and have choice. Previously, he was a design team lead at Office Bureau, a local independent design studio, mainly working in the public sector. Since 2019, Chris has taught in the School of Design at George Brown College and the Faculty of Design at OCAD University in graphic design, typography, and interaction design. He considers his approach to practicing and teaching as malleable and flexible, just like this bio. Kiefer Ortuost is a soon-to-be double alumni from George Brown College, holding an advanced diploma in interaction design and graduating from the Honors Bachelor of Digital Experience Design in the coming weeks. His vision is to combine design, technology, and business to create digital experiences for brands that will help expand their capacity for impact. He recently worked with Abilities to Work, an organization that helps people with disabilities to find their future in the workplace. Currently, he is researching practical and accessible use cases for technology within Web3. Welcome, Kiefer. Finally, we have Arjun Singh. Since he was 18, Arjun has had the opportunity to study abroad in the USA, the UK, Ireland, Scotland, and Canada. Arjun graduated as an industrial designer from a small town in southern United States, but soon realized that he wanted to work at the intersection of products and systems. He started devoting more time on the interactions, as much if not more than the aesthetics. Taking all of his experiences, he always looks to create something unique and believes that his ability to think, humanly helps him be a better designer. Having met his family only once a year on average throughout his college life, he became accustomed to connecting with people from different backgrounds at an early age and has been interested in inclusion and accessibility in design thereafter. With that, I would like to take an opportunity to get us started with our conversations. Now, my first question is just an opening question for everybody. As a designer and designers from lots of different backgrounds, what does accessibility mean to you? And maybe we could start with Janice and Edmund, and then go to Chris, and finally Arjun and Kiefer.
Great, thanks, Anna. Accessibility is more of a philosophy. When I approach it, I think about what an experience is. It's not just visual. It takes into account all sorts of things. Everything kind of influences what our experiences are. It sometimes boggles my mind how much people don't realize who their audiences are, that they could even be employees at companies, like especially if you're working on tools internally. Like we as designers are also human as well. So design tools also should be accessible. Also taking the approach that design for accessibility should never come from a stance of pity, like, oh my gosh, this person can't do this, so therefore, we have to make this exception for them. But looking at it and approaching solutions as things that enable and allow them to achieve their goals. So an example of this, like I actually was at a panel event held by the Rgb, and there was a neurodivergent individual, and because of whatever it is she had maybe 2 fingers and 1 eye that was working, but she also managed to learn how to code. She taught herself how to code despite everyone else's criticisms of her ability. And now she works as a professional web developer. Apologize if you're in the audience. This was a long time ago and may not have remembered your name, but do speak up and let me know if you're out there.
Thanks, Janice. I think as a designer, I started working as a designer in the exhibit world, and to us, designing spaces that is accessible to people was kind of the basis of the work, even before there are accessibility requirements and so on. Like, if you put something out there, people needs to be able to read it. Oftentimes people coming into an exhibit, there's a limitation of time they can spend, so they need to be able to access those information timely. And so you have to think about like how much text you're putting in, and people engage with things, learn in different ways. So some people prefer to read, some people can read, some people cannot, some people would learn quicker if they see a picture. Some people learn faster if they are doing things. So providing multiple modes of communication, repeating, like building a layer of repetitiveness is important. So then you asked about, I think the topic for us is inclusive design and accessibility and the junction of it. In my perspective, the two are the same thing, just looking at it in different ways. So I think in order to be accessible, it needs to be inclusive. But inclusivity is, to me, it's a positive way of looking at things. Like Janice was saying, like not to look at it as, hey, people are having problems, so let's deal with that. It's more like every one of us have a spectrum of ability throughout our life. And so when we were kids, our reaching distance is different. Our reading height is different. Our ability to read and communicate is different. As you grow older, those things will change. And it could change for the better, or it could change for the worse. You may have lost your vision at some point, maybe temporarily. you might have hurt your back, so suddenly you're not any different than an old man. You might be a new parent, and suddenly you are with a stroller, and you are on the same boat with somebody who's on a wheelchair. If you want to get around, it needs to be something that supports a mobile device that uses wheels. So thinking that way, I think it's a good way to believe in the efforts of what we are trying to achieve, and thinking in a way that we don't necessarily have to be able to help everybody at this, right away, but in kind of increment levels, we can help more and more people as we try harder and harder.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Edmund. I really liked what you said about accessibility and the sort of intersection with inclusion, and why they're part and parcel of the same. In preparation for today's panel, I was doing a bit of reading on the differences between accessibility and inclusive design and how people define the two. And one of the things that gets thrown into the mix, obviously, is when you talk about diversity and differences of opinions and differences of backgrounds and this kind of thing. And I read a quote which I thought was a little bit cheesy, but kind of really stuck with me. And it was that it's by Brenda Myers, who was a VP of inclusion strategy at Netflix. And they said diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And so it's this kind of semblance of like, what are we doing to go beyond and say, not just you're invited to this sort of space and we want to share this space with you, but what are we doing to make sure that people feel included and that they're part of that conversation, right? So yeah, I think it's some really good points there. Chris, what about for you?
Wow, thank you, Edmund, Janice, and Anna. For me, as a designer, accessibility has been, it's interesting that you say, Edmund, from just thinking about it from a time perspective, because I instantly go to how, in Canada, especially, there's more and more older people, right? Like we're going to have an aging population that we're going to have to take care of our elders in a way, and just thinking about time span rather than just right now, this week, today, but to think about it from multiple generations forward and back. For me, it's really about choice. Like that we could, talk so much about certain types of technologies and environments that are built or service design. But for me, it's like the ability to have a choice, so that as a user or reader or viewer, or, participant, someone who's participating in the action of using something, but they have a choice. So maybe it's less about the designer who orders things in a certain way, but maybe it's the user who can change the order of what they're being served, or maybe it's a way to, within the operating system, undo the whole from an interaction, which we're losing progressively with these, depending on the operating system, it changes. So just thinking about it from a time perspective, but for me, a big part of it is given the ability to choose and not just have the choice made for you. And so that goes through even just like a form on a website can have so many binaries, and talk about, certification and passports. Like Chris Lee is a really great designer who talks about security and documentation as a form of design history that's not really talked about. So thinking about that from a binary perspective. But yeah, so for me, it's a big thing is choice. And if the user has choice and they can, maybe it's a tool that they're using. It's not even just like something that they're just reading, but they're actually, maybe the tool leads to more form. And so they're able to, change the text size, or able to change the color. So the control of the designer is like, Kelly this morning talked about decentering the designer. It's perfect. It's talking about how, maybe the choice isn't up to the expert, and maybe the designer is minimizing harm rather than instantly thinking they're solving problems. So yeah, for me, choice leads to empowerment, basically, in short. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that's great. And I think you did a really good job, Chris, of getting us to that narrative piece there. I think it's really important. And I would agree. I think choice is king in lots of scenarios. Going to jump to Arjun and Kiefer. As a designer, what does accessibility mean to you? As a designer who's about to take on the world, actually, as graduates.
Yeah, I think for me, as an industrial designer when I graduated, and since then I've been learning and hearing that designing for everyone is designing for no one, basically, and kind of taking that and looking at it in a way where what can we do, in fact, to then more and more include people more and more, right? It's about saying that, of course, we can't design for everybody. Of course, we have to have target populations. Of course, when we're designing that, we have to think about personas maybe and things like that. But how can we design in a way where, at least like Chris mentioned as well, people have a choice, right? If, let's say, I don't have the ability to be a fast texter, can I simply use voice text even to type, right? Things like that. I think this goes back to just even thinking about my childhood, and when we started learning computers and phones, and how much more comfortable we are with technology than maybe our parents are, was something that I looked at and tried to realize what that difference really is and why that is, and how can we make technology more accessible to them. And so I think that's what accessibility and inclusion means to me at this point. And I try to continue to, develop more and more in the sense as to learn what that means, but also to take what I have experienced and I think move with that forward. And two things I think that have come from the Yes Show this year, as well as two quotes that I would like to bring up. One is, design is not what you make, it's about what you make possible, right? And I think that is a very strong quote with this. And then the other, that it's okay to not know, but it's not okay to keep not knowing. And I think I would like to leave it at that, because, moving forward, it's about saying, how can we do better? And that's the kind of mentality that I like to try to live by every day. So.
That's great, Arjun. Really good job of bringing the rest of Yes into the picture today as well. It's great.
Thank you.
Kiefer.
Yeah, all those answers were pretty great. So it's nice that I'm last, so I can kind of gather all of them and form them into my own answer. But for me, when I think of accessibility, I think of accessible. And when you kind of break down those that word, you have access and then able, right? So you have access and able. So you want to provide access to whatever the tools or the functionality that you want, especially in the digital space. But you also want to empower people to be able, right, to do the things that they want to do, give them the tools that they want to use, right? So empowering, enabling them, and inclusion to me, kind of echoing what Edmund and Chris kind of said, the kind of intersectionality of accessibility and inclusion is that inclusion to me is kind of not designing for yourself. It's kind of designing for who isn't this for. Who are you designing for that's like not here, or that who could be using this thing, right? I think there's an example, I think, with Jeff Bezos at Amazon, that like at boardrooms, he would leave like an empty chair like in the boardroom, and like that represented the person who wasn't in the room. And for them at that time, it was the customer. But if we take that philosophy with ourselves, it's like we're designing these websites, these products, these designs for our intended audience. But who else could this be for, that could be using this thing potentially, right? So having accessibility and that kind of philosophy with inclusion kind of puts into perspective that the most of the world that we live in is pretty average, and that it's designed for the average user and the average height, site, and whatever. So thinking about who are the outliers and kind of designing to include all of those people into that pool to, be giving access to those people to do those things that they want to do. So, yeah. Sorry, that was kind of messed up, but yeah.
No, I think you made a lot of really good points and a really good space to kind of lead us into my next question, which is around the sort of experiential component. And so lots of different folks here with lots of different experiences, lots of different times and places in their careers. So I think the question that I want to ask is a bit anecdotal, and maybe we could get, not everyone has to answer, but some experiences that you've had with designing for accessibility, and whether you want to talk about a specific project and how you kind of worked through the process of that project. Did you work with varying stakeholders? I think just to get an understanding so that people can see what different ways of approaching accessibility are. So I think one of the things that can be really overwhelming for someone that isn't comfortable in this space is not knowing where to start. So, how do you do the research? How do you work with people? How do you find that sensitivity point? How do you offer more choice? So I think before we talk about resources and that kind of space, can we talk a little bit about some of the experiences that you folks have had with designing for accessibility?
Yeah, for sure. So I can recall back in 2014 when I first learned about the concept of accessibility. Back then, I think it was first learning about it from the legal perspective, and then learning about it from the UI perspective. Most of my career has been in UX and UI and primarily in the virtual space. And at the time, I had no idea what accessibility was about. My boss said to me, hey, how long will it take you to do an accessibility audit? I was like, I have no idea. What am I going to do? I don't know. Right. And he basically said, you have 1 month, go. And with that, I dug deep into Google to try and find, that's where I learned about WCAG guidelines, just to start. And at the time, when my practice, it was more by rote. WCAG states, oh, this is the right thing to do for this case. And there's it's almost like a checklist system, right? So any of us who know, if you've designed anything for other humans, without their input, that can be a little catastrophic. So in that experience, it was okay for the time, but in retrospect, we really should have taken more of a user research-based focus towards that project. So that was one huge learning that I gained from that experience. And since then, in my practice and in my philosophy of approaching accessibility, is always about research and collaboration first. Even WCAG, they even say that, oh, no matter what they say, even if they have like this checklist of standards, they are guidelines because people are individualized. So depending on who your audience is, you may want to ask them first and consult with them first. Like another example is when I was working on a project, it was just at a hackathon, and I was working with a doctor who advised about what charting is like for in the medical space. And in the solution, I'd included a chart that was so chaotic. If anyone else was looking at this, would be like, oh, I don't know what's going on. But the doctor very clearly understood, like he said, yeah, totally. Anybody in medical space, at a glance, very clear, right? So it's really important to really understand who you're designing for. And this can extend to design systems, it can extend to physical spaces, anything that you're working with. And the other thing that's really important is, as designers, that we really hold our moral ground when it comes to accessibility. Because half the work is not even designing or crafting the solution. Half the work is advocacy and informing others about accessibility being the right thing to do and modeling that in the solutions that we craft. So that's my big takeaway.
I love how Janice talked about asking the end user and listening to what their needs are. I think Anna, your question to me, it's a very deep question. It's very difficult to answer. You're basically asking me how do I design in the last 25 years. So that's a long story. So I'll try to do it in steps. So I think the first time I heard about accessibility standards was maybe in the year 2000 when I was working on the first exhibit for the Smithsonian. So they have an exhibit standard for accessibility. Or the other way around, a standard for accessibility in exhibit design. The funniest thing is when we actually went through all the requirements, we were like looking at each other and we're like, well, that's exactly what we have been doing. So we have, because we deal with designing in space, graphic design in space. So we always have on the wall marking of, the different heights. So like increments of heights, and we would check and print stuff out and put it on the wall and check, hey, like, can you read it? Can't read it? Okay, maybe it needs to be bigger, and so on. So reaching height, we have been kind of tracking that, like checking and kind of on our own, and see like anyone who's in the room who's kind of shorter, taller, and see how that works. So the funniest thing is like these standards oftentimes are what we call common sense. But there's like Kiva was saying earlier, there's like we have to look at what the current kind of general public is. Because I remember when I first came to Canada, and I don't like English was not my first language. It's tricky for me to understand something, like we call things differently, and so even if it's the same thing, there is a different term, and if you recognize it, wonderful for you. If you don't recognize it, then you might have to try and find out. And when I first came here, I couldn't use the washer because everything's too high for me. So urinal for guys, it's if it's too high, then it's useless. Same thing with text. Everything was mounted too high, and those are difficult. And these things are changing these days, and because there are now regulations, and being compliant is different than being accessible. So if you are just sticking to the rules and just following all these guidelines, and sometimes there are regulations and you must follow, sometimes there are kind of suggestions and you could follow if you can, but oftentimes the key thing is really about looking around and asking people and asking the end user. I remember one job that I was working on, funny enough, accessibility audit for a museum. And they were trying to implement a system so people who have problems reading could use a device, and there are stations throughout the exhibit that you could access if you know where the access point is. So there are braille, and there are these kind of tactile elements that they want to put on the floor so people can detect. But then I was walking around and I was wondering, like, so does this work? And the person who was guiding me was like, I don't know. Did you talk to somebody? No, we haven't. And miraculously, there was a blind person right in front of us. And we're like, well, can I just ask the person? And she was like, oh, yeah, let's do that. And I don't speak French, and I needed a translator. But at the end, like the person told me what to do. Because if I follow protocols and I follow accessibility guidelines, there is no such thing about the things that we were trying to deploy. So there's no requirement per se, but there are requirements that if you follow will not work. So I think keeping an open eye, asking people, being patient and listening are important.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just gonna go to Chris. So Chris, I know we lost you for a moment there. Just asking a little bit about your experiences with designing for accessibility and how it fits into your practice as a designer.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, sorry, we could talk about internet access next. No, but how it fits as a designer. So for me, I never really learned any of this when I was in school, in undergrad and whatnot, and I learned on the job. So I'm really, grateful for, being thrown into it in a sense, and being able to be immersed into it and realize, like, oh yeah, there is a word for that. I was just sort of somewhat thinking of this maybe intuitively, or maybe listen to previous profs like saying print out in black and white, check the contrast as a trick, things like that, or squint your eyes to like really kind of see maybe what someone might not be able to see, as well. And just thinking about it as a spectrum. And at my old studio, we talked about it almost as a gradient as well, of abilities and differences and nuances. And it's so contextual, like thinking about it from like, it's a punk zine versus a vaccine intake form on a website. So thinking about the audience as well. But for me, I learned on the job. I was really, privileged and fortunate to be able to be in those conversations, and then to also less me become the accessibility advocate always, but also, make sure the team and my colleagues, coworkers are also aware of this as well. So we would do things like lunch and learns, the dreaded lunch and learn, but it gives you experience and to be able to communicate about these things that are very, very important from start to finish, rather than something that's just tacked on at the end as a checkbox. So for me, it was a humbling experience, like when you're on certain projects. Specifically, I remember one for Forest, Ontario at my old studio at Office Bureau, and shout out to John and Jacob, who pushed me into this world that I didn't know really existed until I found out there's a word for it, and understanding that, like, disabilities are not always visual, right? And that was, learned about my own in a sense as well, in certain ways. So thinking about all the different senses. But when I go back to this one project for Forest Ontario, to get back to that, is, looking at the type size just only, and just seeing that, like, oh, what I thought was right was maybe not right for that context. And it required a redesign, for instance, going from, 8/12, 9/12 to what about making it like 11 points or 12 points? And what if that is actually suitable for the frame of reference, which was like 8.5 by 11 booklet, because the core audience, the average age was 65, it was 60. It wasn't me. So I think getting back to Kelly this morning, and just centering the designer, decentering the educator is extremely important. It's not just about you, it's about kind of like rising the tide with, your communities and your networks. And it's not just something tacked on at the end, just for legislation or compliance, which Edmund was talking about. So, and Janice as well, from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, really, really good points, Chris. And there's quite a bit of action in the chat. Folks talking about how accessibility isn't a checklist, shouldn't be an afterthought. It's really a democratic experience and philosophy for people. And again, thinking about accessibility at the start and not at the end of a project, where you're thinking, okay, well, now how do we make it accessible, right? Because then we know that we're not having consideration for all of the users that are going to be part of whatever the design is. Going to Arjun and Kiefer, and perhaps a little bit of a different perspective, talking about accessibility. Kiefer, I know that you were part of Abilities to Work, so maybe a good opportunity to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I first started learning about accessibility in school, it was just the typical, color, contrast, font size, and all that stuff. Especially we were talking about like on the web or product design and stuff like that. So that was my extent of accessibility at the time. But when I started working with Abilities to Work, it was more from a research standpoint, but I started to realize that there's more of a systematic kind of view on accessibility, especially with people with disabilities. Again, mentioning how a lot of our world is average, right? So there's a system in place that's somewhat not for these people right now, for some of these products and systems, right? So how do we design for that? How do we pivot, especially with what some of these unique people's how do they already contextualize how they use their cell phone or the computer, right? Like if they use voice recognition or the keypad, how do we design that they don't have to change their routine or idiosyncrasies? How do they already operate the system, right? Just because like we usually just like use our smartphone, just scroll touch screen, right? But that's not the same for everybody, right? So how do we kind of pivot and design for that? Another thing too is that when we're kind of at the interview phase of our project at Abilities to Work, is that a lot of the people we talk to also don't really feel comfortable disclosing their disability, or they don't want to share whatever disability or thing that they might need accommodation with, just because of the fear that they'll be seen differently because they need it. And so because there's that perception, well, we shouldn't even like be looked at as a sympathetic way, right? That it's bringing back to like what Jana was saying, is that it's normal. It's how you normally operate. So kind of overcoming that fear of not wanting to disclose that information is somewhat difficult for people that do have their disabilities. And props to everybody that does, and they're fully comfortable with disclosing that information, just because that also gives us the leverage and the information that we need to move forward with some of their designs. And then going back to what Edmund and Chris and everybody else was saying about compliance and accessibility, more so with startups and kind of companies that prioritize features and getting designs out there. They prioritize just getting the product out there as fast as possible and testing it, rather than thinking about accessibility in parallel with the design or even before, right? So a lot of products will be pushed out, and then accessibility is an afterthought, and they get feedback from everybody and be like, oh, okay, we need to change this because this is what people are saying. If accessibility and inclusion is included early on in the process and continue out in parallel throughout the whole entire process, I think a lot of products would be a lot more accessible and a lot more easier to use for everybody.
Yeah, those are really, really good points, Kiefer. I think they kind of go back a little bit to what Chris was saying too, not necessarily operating in silos where you have a team that's tasked with accessibility, but having this sort of like systemic approach to understanding why the system of designing for accessibility is so critical. Arjun, I'm not sure if you wanted to share something about this one as well.
Yeah, a couple things. I think one, just starting off with saying that, I've been at companies, I think 3 or 4 places at least, where that was never even something that people talked about, right? When we're designing products, we're not really including, of course, people that should be on the team, not thinking about how that should be done and things like that. Sometimes, I was in the shoe design factory, let's say, and even though you don't think of it as something that should matter, in a way it is something that does in fact become a choice even, right? So what I mean by that is that not having, let's say, people that you are designing for on the team, and this is something that other people have mentioned as well, is something that you don't realize at the time, but then you put your products out and realize or think about why they're not really working, is because you haven't really considered everybody that you should. And I think the second thing that I want to mention, and really this doesn't really, I think, talk about exactly what your question was, but I think what it was an experience that I had was with somebody, and I used to work somewhere at a library in my undergrad, and somebody had come in, and the elevator that we had was not really an accessible elevator, whereas they couldn't really access it on their own, and I would have to take them to a particular floor every time they came in on a wheelchair. And there was one time when their wheelchair really just got stuck underneath a like one of the handles on the elevator. And really, that was one of my first experiences with something like that. And I really, at the time, did not know how to react to that, right? Because we're always told not to just give or ask for, or just help without being asked for it sometimes. And it is a reaction that we sometimes have, is, just going in and saying, okay, I'm just going to help that person if they dropped something, or if, something is wrong. But I think that is something that I've thought about since then. It is an experience where, why did the wheelchair get stuck under that handle? Was the handle in the wrong place? Was the elevator not big enough to where they could turn their wheelchair around? Because they would have to go in straight and then come back out the same way. They couldn't really turn the wheelchair around in the elevator because of how small that was, right? So just thinking about those things and saying, as designers, of course, it is our responsibility to start really like pushing that. And from there, like, what Chris was saying too, with digital experiences, starting with, let's say, even like a mobile first approach. That is the smallest thing that you can do, I would say. And then with contrast and things like that as well. And, since that, I've been working on a couple of websites and things like that, starting to ask these questions, with logos as well and text and all that everybody has mentioned today is something that feels so small, but has such a large impact.
Yeah, really good point there, Arjun. I wanted to ask a question. We've touched a little bit and kind of danced around this topic, and I know maybe this is a bit uncomfortable for people because obviously we're an educational institution putting on an event about accessibility, but I'm going to ask the question about what the obligation of educational institutions is in the space of accessibility, particularly design schools, design institutions, design startups. How do we, I guess my first question is, what role do you think that educational institutions have to play in this space? I know a lot of you have said your interventions with accessibility came after you had been trained as designers and you walked into the working world. What do you think the role of educational institutions is, and where can we start for those that haven't yet started down this journey?
I would say leading by example would be a good first start. The school itself is a fairly controlled environment. People who are coming here are people who are expecting to learn, and then I think if they're coming in and they experience things in a way that is accessible, and there's a layer of thoughts behind it, that people will eventually pick it up without going through a specific curriculum. But then on top of that, of course, if there could be additional layers in the curriculum to highlight some of those thoughts, and even potentially some of the current policies and current standards that people might need to know about. If there could be some highlight of that would kind of help to form some basis. And I would also assume that, with a student body that is as diverse as, university and colleges, there are ways that people could be, a student and faculty members who could have actual disabilities that they could speak about and share to the class and let people know, like such challenges, and you can solve it in some way, then that would be mean a great deal to me. And I think knowing that these people exist is important. And I really love what Kiba was talking about earlier, that not everybody who has a disability is willing to disclose. In a design school, especially, just imagine if you colorblind, would you tell your fellow students that you colorblind? Maybe you don't want to, but you might want to fake it. But at the same time, say if you're designing something and say it's a map, and you're having everything color coded, wonderful. But what if I can't read that color coding? So I think having that, sharing that knowledge that people with varying abilities exist, and help to introduce ways to help each other could be things that colleges can do.
I would add to, sorry, I was going to say, I wanted to add to what Edmund was saying. I agree with what you mentioned about in education, that educators do need to work on not just sharing the information, but also modeling what appropriate accessible design looks like within their programming. So many times when I've seen slides that don't meet color contrast standards, the white text on yellow background, that's quite common in a lot of even slide templates. So it's interesting. Also that in my past, I was part of an accessibility team responsible for advising other product teams about best practices and how much we're thinking, well, really the goal is to not have our team exist at all. The goal is that teams inherently already know what to do, that they already have those skills in place from an education that embeds it throughout the curriculum. Like, not that it's a part of like as a separate course or separate class, that they learn it when they're learning about typography. They learn it when they're learning about color theory and the principles and the guidelines and best practices for design itself, because it's such an inherent and embedded type of thing. I'd also add, even before post-secondary, even in public school, that there should be a bit more awareness. There is some now, and with a lot of like the inclusive work and decolonization that's been happening recently, a lot of that has been coming up in public schools, but also normalizing that conversation so people feel safer to disclose what they have, and striving towards not moving. Not using labels. Like there's always like that conversation of us versus them. We are the abled, they are the disabled, right? But when you look around, right, and you think about how you frame and reframe what accessibility is and who are the people who use assistive devices. Like when you look at even the people on this panel, right? How many of you are wearing glasses? Did you know glasses are an assistive device, right? So, but you may not identify as a person having a disability, and yet you are still using an assistive device. Every single device that we craft, even our phones, our devices, are the things that we use. The internet is an assistive device that assists us with communication or assists us with our everyday lives. So when you reframe that, then you go back and you think about how you're designing things, and you think about who it is that you're designing for. That may change your mind a little bit about your approach.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I really love, Janice, that you brought up that, because all technology is assistive. I just put a link in the chat from Wired from 2014 there, but maybe Anna, you could.
It's in you put it in the private chat, but I'll put it. I'll share with everybody. Yeah.
Oh, this is a strange interface. Okay, so this is a huge question. Whew. So for me, I didn't really learn too much in my undergrad. As an educator now, I try to thread it in everything that I can within the time limit and the class sizes. But this needs to be normalized to a point where it's not just a category, or it's not just like this other thing. And we talk about the othering and in terms of how we classify and use words and specific language as well. I think speaking from not saying the other, or someone that's just different than you, is less of a best practice. Like even the words best practice, I have issues with. Anyways, future essay, maybe, whatever. But for me, it's been difficult because I don't think there should be a class called Accessibility 101 or Accessibility 1 and then 2 and then 3 and 4. I think that's probably not the route to go. I think it just needs to be threaded in every single class that we do, as we've been kind of discussing here. And it's hard, but I think that you can do it in weekly critiques too, from an educational perspective. Like, sure, color contrast, text size, but what if you give that control over to the user? It's not even about you. You're just kind of setting up the framework to facilitate that interaction, for instance. And I think, what about language? What about how, in Edmund, in that the book that you co-authored with the Rgb Handbook is a great place to start. If we can get to that, probably is later, but for resources, is that Rgb Handbook. It's a pretty good synopsis and summary of how accessibility touches our everyday life. But yeah, so it's difficult because you know, we talk about stigmatization a little bit here too, and I think from a student perspective, back in the day, there wasn't a lot of accessibility accommodations. So, you know, now as an educator, I get a bunch of those letters and I love every one of them and I try to adhere to them. It's difficult when you have a class of 26 to 35 in a studio-based environment. It's not a seminar, it's studio-based, it's project-based. But we can include this in what we teach. We can include this in the conversations we have week to week. And then from a privacy perspective too, to be considerate of others, that it's deeply nuanced and not everyone wants to be, you know, tokenized, like, oh, you're this, so let's ask that person. That's like the worst thing you can do. So I think talking about this from a nuanced perspective and in a way that you're not just considering what's best because it's your personal taste too, is something that I think, for me, I'm just afraid of absolutes. You know, like I think of, if I can bring a quote in here, from Jane Jacobs, who said, virtually all ideologues of any variety are fearful and insecure, which is why they are drawn to ideologies that promise prefabricated answers for all circumstances. So this is from Dark Age Ahead from 2004, but basically saying that, you know, be aware of absolutes and that they don't necessarily answer all the questions in this sort of like one world perspective. So as educators, knowing that there's a plurality of ways of doing this, like, you know, I have this, just get into this Arturo Escobar designs for the pluriverse as an example. And even like Joseph Albers talked about an interaction of color, you know, that, you know, we're all colorblind to an extent. And if I say the word red, we're all going to have a different tint of red when we think of it, you know, and goes through these exercises of trying to get away from absolutes. So I also want like accessibility in the future to not just be about, you know, this is the best practice of this time and, you know, speaking in absolutes, but building in a gradient, a spectrum of answers too, where, and you might be able to change it in the future. If it's a website, it can be updated, right? It's malleable. It's not just stuck forever in stone. So something to think about. From a built environment, that's a whole other thing. And Edmund has spoken about that. So
that's great, Chris. I'm not sure if you saw the comment earlier, but it was a student shouting out your inclusion of accessibility in your type classes. So big kudos there. I do want to talk a little bit about resources because I know we've kind of touched on that, but I'm going to go to some audience questions first. The chat is pretty lively for those of you that aren't watching it. My first question that I'm going to go to is from Evelyn. Hi, Evelyn. How do you see the role of designers in creating inclusive design if those affected don't want or can't be at the table together? So for example, confronting trust, understanding trauma, decolonization, etc. Not sure if someone has a specific response or wants to tackle this one. It's a really, really good question, I think.
Yeah, there are two layers in that question, or maybe more than two, but I think for one is for people who couldn't be part of that inclusion design table. What do we do? I think that doesn't specifically talk about kind of the decolonization, the First Nations recognition type effort that we're talking about. I think in that last bracket in there. So without people being able to be at the at the discussion table, that's probably a sign that something needs to change. I think for sure, if we're talking about inclusivity in terms of accessibility and kind of like physical and mental struggles that people are having in that environment that you're designing, then trying to be at your best, if you can think about those things. Like when we are designing, say, tactile maps, for instance, I always ask the designers to try to imagine if you like pick up two symbols that is on a sample and see if you can close your eyes and tell the difference. If you can't, then like that means what you are picking is probably too complicated. And so trying to imagine if you if you are that person, what kind of help would you need? I think it would be easier if you can think about those things and say, in terms of writing, are you writing text that is simple enough that people who are, let's say, a second grader can understand it? Somebody who's from a different country just came in, are you writing too much? People are they unable to understand what you're trying to communicate? So putting yourself into someone else's shoe, if you are truly restricted to have access to the person you need, then those are the kind of things you can do. But of course, the best solution is to have that person at the table, and maybe ask the question. If you have a client in front of you, ask, hey, can I speak to somebody, say, in your organization who is a First Nations background? If it is a museum that you're working with, is there a First Nation advisory circle that you have been dealing with, or a sister organization who can give you access to that group? I think having that first-hand information is always the best, but with the absence of it, try to put yourself in that person's shoe.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
And sometimes it could be really challenging when it comes to trying to find users, especially with user research. But part of it could be solved by being very transparent in your messaging to them, thinking about telling them where and when and how this information will be used. Because remember, sometimes some groups, like, they feel like they've been taken advantage of quite a bit, and letting them know that, hey, no, this is not us taking advantage of you. This is us trying to build it for you. So that sort of reframing goes quite a long way. And also, along with what Edmund was mentioning, if because I know that budgets are a thing. If certain scenarios don't allow you to have that user research, then certainly there are tools out there to simulate that experience, but just knowing that that's for ideation purposes only, and it's never going to substitute for someone who has like a full-on disability. Like, say, a person who is hopping on one leg for a day it's not the same as like someone who has fractured their ankle for a couple months, who then therefore is not the same experience as someone who just doesn't have that leg, and that's just how they're living for the rest of their lives. So there are considerations in terms of how much you use empathy in your solution that you craft.
Yeah, I think to touch up or to expand a little bit about what Janice just said as well is, thinking about those three scenarios, right? Somebody who just is just limping on one leg for a day versus somebody who got hurt and is fractured for a couple of months versus somebody who maybe doesn't have a leg. I think thinking about that, you also have to start to think about how these people that you can call them a disability, but how they have started to use that in their own advantage sometimes as well. That could be multiple different things, but how have they gotten used to this? Because sometimes when we're designing maybe and thinking, maybe they need help with this or that, but it could be where they've already accomplished that challenge, right? And they've already said, okay, I can already do this without the help of, let's say, a bar. I can stand without the help of a bar, whatever that might be. I think that is why it's not about designing for them, but designing with them, right? Taking them at the table and saying, yes, we understand some of it, or we can maybe start to think about these things, but taking them with you and saying, what are these challenges, of course, that you can help us understand even better, will never replace that.
I think really good point. And I wanted to go back to something that you said, Janice, around budgets, right? We hear this constantly. Oh, it's not in the budget. That's one of the chief sort of, I don't want to say excuse, but one of the chief excuses that people have around designing for accessibility is just really expensive, right? And we don't have the money to do usability testing, and we don't have the money to do user research, and we can't pay people to do these things. I do want to go to another audience question, but just to quickly, how do we respond when people say it's just too expensive?
Oh, for sure. I hear it all the time. Even when you're considering accommodations for employees, the average cost is actually only $500 more to accommodate for an employee, right? It's not that much. But at the same time, a lot of companies, they're very short-sighted when it comes to their investments. So they think, oh, well, it's expensive now, and then that's it. That's the end of the sentence, right? But no, technically, what I've seen is that the ROI, especially in e-commerce, to have an inaccessible site in e-commerce, you're losing out on billions, right? Someone can't read your product description. They don't know anything about it. They don't know how to use it, whatever it is, right? The ROI is actually in the billions. So you spend a few bucks now, but in the future, the return is quite large. And I know that P&L is something that's super important in the language of business, but speaking to it from that lens tends to help.
I would say, like Anna, you were talking about earlier, have that conversation up front. So you never get to that stage when we talking about expenses at the end of the project. I think some of that also helps in terms of the kind of regulations and having being able to say that, hey, like if you don't do that, you're not compliant. Like so back, like I think arming yourself with knowledge to know what the governments and larger organizations have already done as incentives to help convince people who are unwilling to do a step more. But I have to admit that I have been lucky enough that many of the projects that land on my desk happens to be the ones that when I asked that question at the kickoff meeting, the client would say, do the right thing, or we don't want to just meet the standard. So tell us what you can do more. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes you may think that a client who is, say, in the financial world don't want to do more, but you never know. So ask the question early.
Yeah, so really good points. Chris, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to add something there?
Yeah, sorry, I just want to jump right into that one.
Yeah.
I've been pretty lucky to work at a studio that respected accessibility, that wanted to get better at it and understand it more and make it a part of their ethos and value system, which is rare in this industry. But hopefully getting better incremental change. Kelly this morning again. From a budget perspective, yeah, it's interesting. I find that, in my past experience, it's generally it's a line item. It's there's a whole section of a quote or for a budget that talks about this. And yes, it is law in many countries now. And I think Ontario has kind of led the way in that sense of kind of, leading with this legislation. I think in 2005 was AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians Disability Act. So, and some companies do need for it to be, law, and that's sad, but it's a step. Let's keep going, But yeah, what was I trying to say about budgets is that I've been lucky with Edmund too. It's just that, like, when I saw that question, I was like, really? That you get that? And it's just, oof, because I think, what I don't want to see is like an audit after the fact where it's like, these are the proposed changes and they don't even make those changes, but they did the audit, so then they can just check a box. That's an example that's happened a few times. But from a budget perspective, yeah, like this conversation reminds me of sort of like climate change, right? Like there's that argument that, oh, by going green, it costs more money, but it doesn't. It's actually better for business in the long term. And it's actually, there's a better ROI too. So if you do need to look at it in those terms, return on investment. So I think there was an article in the Globe Mail a few years ago that talked about that, like how like moving to greener technologies is actually better for business. So you can't make that argument anymore about that it costs too much. So I think it's kind of the same thing here a little bit. But anyways, so yeah, when I saw that question, it made me angry, but I'm trying to like also, you know, keep this in a generous perspective and not about like, this is right, this is wrong. It's that this is a process, and, you know, like Arjun said at the start of the call, let's just get better, right? It's incremental. It's not just like, this is accessible, this is not, you know, like I think there's definitely gradations there, but start early, but incorporate it in your budget, incorporate it in your quotes as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things that has come up quite a bit in the last couple of days of year-end show, is unfortunately talking a lot about capitalism and what role capitalism plays, and also like deep-seated roots of people being like, this is what we've always done, and why should we change it now? Which, you know, that recognition that like, just because you've always done something a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. Quite the opposite, actually. I wanted to go to two questions from the chat that I think are really, really good. Both of them I think are probably very good for young designers. There is this sort of trend, I feel, with young designers where they want to be cool, they want to be edgy, they want to make sure they're using, you know, the coolest typefaces, but then what, right? And so how accessible is this? So how do you understand the relationship between sometimes abandoning this concept of a beautiful and conceptual design with fancy typography and colors in the name of its functionality? And there was some feedback in the chat about accessible design actually being very beautiful as well. But as a young designer, when you kind of want to be on this cusp of trends, how do you balance things out? Thanks, Juliana, for your question.
Well, I would actually throw it back to you, Juliana, is when you think about how you design, so what good is a beautiful conceptual design with fancy typography if it's not accessible to people, especially to your audience, right? Because design, when you think about the definition of design, design is about the craft of a solution for another human being. And if you can't reach your audience, then, you know, you may have to rethink it, because you know, we're not in the business of designing for ourselves or creating solutions for ourselves. This is not like a fine arts thing. You're not doing it just to represent your own needs, right? You're doing it typically to design for someone else who's not you, and their preferences may be quite different from yours, and their ability to see things might be quite different from yours. So it's interesting to see this this struggle. I see this actually all the time with a lot of design students, where, you know, they do want to do something that pushes those boundaries and makes it very edgy, right? So like that I really encourage. Experimentation is always like a great thing, but at the same time, you do have to balance it with being able to meet the needs of whatever it is that you're crafting for. So there is therefore that fine line.
Mm-hmm. And I think like things change, trend changes over time. I was recently being asked to write an article about schoolwork that I've done and critique my own work. And it was kind of exactly the same thing that you're talking about with this question, Gianna. I think I was looking at my own work, and it was like, well, if I do it again, I will not be able to do this, because overlapping type with busy background, it's just crazy. No one can read it. I cannot read it now because my eyesight have changed. You know, those are things that you learned from school from the beginning. Small steps sometimes, you know, like remember the first time your instructor told you that, hey, don't use 8-point type. That's silly. Like, you're not going to be able to read it. Watch your line length. You better break at some point here, because you can't find the next line if you don't do it there. You have been adjusting your design to make sure that they are readable to people. Those are skills that you have earned, that you may forgot, that you know, the reason why you are here now is because you have picked up all those skills. Those are accessibility steps as well. And I think there isn't that strong line about, hey, you do this and it's accessible. You don't do this and it's not accessible. There's always one step you can do further to make it more accessible, more reachable to more a wider audience. And I think that's the goal. Can that be something that's beautiful? I would hope that all of us who are here, who have been practicing doing more accessible design every day, that some of our portfolio could convince you otherwise.
Yeah, I think really.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, Chris. I know. I knew you were going to want to answer because I know this is a space that you play in, and Chris teaches typography for us in both the brand design program and graphic design program, and I figured you might have something you wanted to add here. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, from personal experience too, like I can think of an example when I was a part of a project where this happened a few times actually, and I got to credit my old boss, Jacob Sherrard at Office Bureau. Shout out, Jacob. Probably not here, but maybe you are. It'd be amazing. You know, when I was really starting to understand that there's a whole world that in field and books and knowledge and all of this shared experiences and unshared experiences, I realized that, like, you know, I was trying to like advocate for an accessible version of something, and then Jacob was like, well, why would you do that? Why don't we just make the one thing accessible? And so that took me a few years to get over. I got over that, I think. And I think for me, it's very contextual, you know, like, you know, your audience, if it's a photocopied zine versus a vaccine intake form, right? Two different, maybe the same audience, but, you know, like totally different context, right? So context is very important. You can still do both. It can still be big, bold, beautiful too. Like there's, you know, you can use color in large, colorful ways. You can use type in big ways as well. You know, big type can be beautiful. Hopefully you've learned that in my type course. But yeah, you know, but also just kind of like stepping back too and being like, okay. And I know from my experience too, I was always just trying to like design harder, right? Faster, like more intense, like something is XYZ is better. But, you know, like typography is, for instance, the voice of language. And if there's a whole, you know, text on a page and you've outlined the text and now it's a PDF, but it's text as image now, you can't copy and paste it, you can't highlight it, then that means it can't be read out loud. So yeah, to Janice's point before, like you're just, you know, you're creating these barriers and stuff. So you can still have accessible but excited and experimental. I don't think those are opposite, you know, like I think you can combine it so it's one version. It's not like this is the accessible version, which is how I used to think, and I'm slowly trying to transition away from that.
Yeah, I think
to, you know, my work before.
Really good point. And literally, as you were on the cusp of saying that, Lacey just put into the chat, can we just toss the concept of creating separate accessible versions of all things all the way out? And I think it's a great point, Lacey, and definitely a very, very important one. I wanted to go to actually a question from Lacey that I think is a really good pivot point as we kind of wind down. I can't believe that we're almost at time. It's been such a fruitful discussion. Questions for all the panelists. Accessibility conversations usually focus on audio, visual, physical spaces. How do you see mental health supported through design? I think this is a massive question. A lot of people have been thinking quite a bit about their own mental health, particularly in the last 2 years. I know I certainly have, and I'm having lots of conversations with students and my colleagues about this space. So is there, you know, what is that sort of intersection between accessibility and design in the world of mental health, which mental health is health, full stop, right? So how do we merge these two things?
I think before we get to that, I just want to say one little thing about the last conversation that we were having about the question, which the big thing in that was, or what stood out to me was concept. And I think that's what you have to think about is conceptual design. Why is it a conceptual design? When they're creating, think about, and I'm thinking of this as an automotive industry, right? They're creating conceptual designs. Those never get produced. You have to start to think about why they're never getting produced. And it's because a few reasons, right? Maybe that's just too expensive to do. Maybe it's technology that is not accessible to everybody, not good enough for everybody, that kind of thing. And I think that's the key word that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah,
So
that's great. Thanks for that.
With this, this is a really good question. But with it, I would also cite a resource that's kind of an oldie but a goodie by Steve Krug. Don't Make Me Think. Lots of great examples. If you haven't checked out that book, I think he's like on several versions along now. But there's lots of different principles in there. Also in WCAG, there's lots of different guidelines in there. But when we think about what our experiences are when we go through mental health challenges, it is an inherent, like our mental health is an inherent part of our experience, right? And the auditory, the visual, and the physical stimuli impact our emotional experiences, our mental health experiences inside, right? So I would almost argue that you can't really look at like one without the other, right? When you look at a page that's full of text, that's justified and is really dense, like to me, that's really stressful. That's like just to see something that's really difficult to read, right? That can actually be like a little anxiety inducing, right? So there is a huge impact on how the stimulus affects our mental health. But at the same time, there are also a lot of resources that can help advise on how to alleviate this sort of stress. Because the act of design is an act of trying to make something as easy to use as possible or as intuitive as possible, especially if you're crafting it for other humans. So the more that you do that, the easier it gets, the less stress your audience receives, right? Can you imagine way back in 2006 with the first iPhone, the first time you turned it on, the first time you swiped, right? The first time you used like a on-screen keyboard, right? Like how did that make you feel? How intuitive was that, right? So that is essentially the goal.
I could not agree more. I think this is a constant question that we have to ask to ourselves. In my line of work, I do a lot of wayfinding in the healthcare environment. So the kind of rule of thumb for designing in that environment, for wayfinding is you don't. People are already in stress, and when they're at the hospital, so whether they have mental, physical, or other health issues, they are already in stress. You don't want to add more stress. So anything that you can do to make it more clear, anything that you can do to help people think less so they can get to where they need to go, have their appointment on time, I can have my scan, and so on. That helps. And I mean, our desk, our workspace reflects our state of mind. It's the same thing when you are in any kind of environment. If the environment that we design is simpler, it's intuitive, it's clear, then people will get less stressful. And those who are already stressed and they are already experiencing mental health issues, having that clarity could, if not calming their mind, at least not adding more difficulties to them. And then I guess linking back to the last question would be, well, on top of being clear, make it beautiful, make it calming, make it helpful for people to recover. So if you can see the sunlight, any person, if you are having a bad day, you look at the sun and you go, wow, like this is a beautiful place. I can see the end of the tunnel. I can feel a little better than the last moment. Those are good things. And if we can make the design, we can make the space that we live in beautiful, and people will feel better. We cannot control what is inside of them, but we can help to at least not mess it and make it worse.
Yeah, I think to add to that a little bit as well is just a few questions that I wanted to pose to the crowd. Kind of is think about how you would feel if you're in a room that is brightly colored red versus just a room with white walls, right? That could be the start of something. You could start to think about offices and office spaces that have been laid out in different ways, right? How do you feel when you're in a room alone versus how you feel when you're in a room with other people, when you're in cubicles versus when you're in open spaces? Those are things that you have to start to think about. Imagination, design. We are always taught that when you're outside, your imagination always flows better in a way, right? Things like that. But that sometimes can also mean different things for different people. So while I might feel differently when I'm sitting outside designing, could be very different to what somebody else might. So I think, of course, it's kind of coming together where you have to start to think about stepping into other people's shoes and thinking about that, but also thinking about some of these basic things.
That's a really good point, Arjun. I'm getting bombarded with like Teams messages and text messages and the chat here from people. Just like everybody is like obsessed with this panel. Lots of really good things. I think we're giving people lots of really good food for thought. Being mindful that we only have a few minutes left together. I did want to ask resources. Resources is huge, again, for a lot of people that haven't been in this space, that are thinking about, you know what, I would like to make my designs more accessible. I would like to undertake some research now that classes are over, to do a little bit of summer learning, to be a little bit more focused in this space. Where's a good place to start? And I'm going to go to Edmund for very obvious reasons on this one. But maybe everyone could share a little bit about resources that help them, books, podcasts, films, guidebooks, etc. I know we've talked a little bit about them, but a nice little share with the audience would be great.
I think obviously the Rgb handbook is a good place to start. I'm one of the co-writers, so I can say that we put a lot of information, that we share a lot of things that we learn in our career in there, and those are a good starting point. The other thing that I would suggest people do is try to look around. I think now that the restrictions are kind of scaling down and people are able to go around to places, look around places that you visit. What makes things readable? What makes objects usable? What makes it difficult for people to access? And know the difference, and understand that all of us are learning. So talk to people, maybe your parents or your family who are older. See if they react to things differently than you do, and those could be helpful insights. Maybe your text will become bigger, and the contrast may be higher. You may want to talk to some of your siblings or your children in your household, or friends that you have who are still learning to read. You may change some of your design phrases a bit so that they are a little bit easier to understand. So I think just open your eyes and be willing to talk to people and look around.
That's really, really good advice. I dropped the link to the Accessibility 2 handbook in the chat. It is available free online. If you would like a physical copy, you can send me an email. I will make sure that I give you a physical copy. We've got quite a few on campus. Who else would like to share some resources with the audience?
So I like the idea of sharing some movies, because sometimes you get some inspiration from everyday life around us, and movies are a huge part of our culture. So you can think about, let's say, when you watch The Theory of Everything, it's an obvious one, Silver Linings Playbook, or even then there was, I guess, the new, not really new anymore, Joker movie that was out. It was also like a huge discussion about mental health there. And along with Edmund, just looking at everything around you as a user research project. Like, it's an opportunity to see, oh, hey, this thing is not working for that person. Why? And trying to see, and that's the nature of design. There's also joining A11YTO, so LETO. They have a huge community. They also have their own convention as well in the summer. IBM has a toolkit. There's the A11Y project. Microsoft has lots of things going on. Like, I love what they're doing when it comes to accessible video games that are out there. There's from like an accommodation standpoint, there's also askjan.org, which is a great resource because a lot of people who do have disabilities who need that extra inspiration about what they can ask for. Like, that's something that can really help from an employment perspective. And also, yeah, try if you can get yourself a copy of Don't Make Me Think. That is also like a wonderful, wonderful resource as well.
Perfect. I was trying to do the fast Googling and the fast chat typing while you were going. I forgot a couple of things, but for anyone that's watching, and you can see this on YouTube again and just pull some of them back. Anyone else want to share a resource or two before we sign off? Yeah.
100%. If you've had me as a prof, then you know I love a good hyperlink. I just added in the chat an Arena collection. Arena is like Tumblr meets Pinterest without the garbage of tracking users and stuff like that. But anyways, I've been collecting these resources over the years, so that's a public channel. Like, you can add to it as well. There's also a highlight David Lepofsky, who walks through the X University Student Center, and that's just like, if you just watch that video, boom, it hits home for so many different levels of communication and all the different types of technologies that we've been talking about today, and the physical built environment as well. And that building won numerous awards. I'll let David walk you through that on YouTube there, because it's just fantastic. Who is the AODA Alliance Chair, I believe. And I think a prof at U of T Osgood. Okay. But anyway, so there's a couple resources there, and then as well, like, look at bell hooks. Like, look at a variety of books. I'm reading about attachment theory right now and how your childhood informs your adult life. Extra bold, fantastic. There's Kelly Walters came out with a new book called Black, Brown, Latinx Design Educators by Kelly Walters. So and there's Invisible Woman, like Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. So there's lots of different resources. I'm going to try to add a lot of those to that Arena channel so that folks aren't having to go through YouTube too much, but I'll just add it all there. And I think it's open and public, so you can add resources there as well. I don't work for Arena. Should be free for the starter plan, so just full disclosure. Anyways, bye.
That's perfect. Arjun or Kiefer, I'm giving you the last word as upcoming graduates.
I was just going to say, challenge your professors, challenge your peers. That's the first thing that you can do. You're paying for an education, so make sure you're getting the worth out of it, right? If you think that you're not doing enough, always keep questioning the conventional, telling people that you're not learning enough. Hopefully they'll start to push as well.
Yeah, resource-wise, I can't hold like a candle to everybody else's resource list, but one in particular that I've used is AXE, like AXE, and that's specific to web design. So it's a Google Chrome extension, and if you open that up, it'll show all the accessibility issues on any given website. So you can take a look at that stuff and see where things go wrong in terms of accessibility, things you can improve on. But yeah, echoing what Edmund and Janice have mentioned, I kind of like to experiment myself. I'm pretty blind without these glasses, and I've tried doing weird tasks without them on, and just kind of trying to put myself in that perspective of how do blind people actually do things. So it's pretty a wild way of doing things, and just trying to get that perspective.
And if you really like doing experiments, I do have a suggestion. If you still have spare Lego sets from your childhood, pick them out and make patterns and symbols with them. turn off the lights and see if we can still read them.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I only have like a few like Legos, so I don't know if I'll have enough to like make those kinds of things. But I've tried doing like opening a package with like, you know, those like clear stickers at the edge without my glasses, and it's hard. It's so hard to find them just because they're clear stickers, right? And I can't see, so like, yeah, that's kind of an example. But yeah, maybe I'll try that. See if I have enough Legos.
Well, I do have some Legos on campus for prototyping, and so maybe if you drop by, Kiefer, we'll do a little swap. Thank you, everybody. This has been really, really great. I can't believe how quickly time went by. I want to be mindful and thank everyone. We are 2 minutes over. If you are interested in one more talk for the day, great way to have your afternoon coffee, or if you're like me and you've had too much coffee, maybe a good time to transition to water. We have Marlo Anilla, who was a GBC graduate who founded Biography Design. He's joining us this afternoon. It will be our last talk of the day. We have 2 more talks tomorrow. Maurice Cherry in the morning, who's going to be talking about designing at the end of the world, which is very appropriate. And John Maida in the afternoon to close us out, talking a little bit about resiliency and failing fast. Again, I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today. It was a great afternoon, a lot of food for thought, a lot to read this weekend, certainly for most of us. So again, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you, and it was great to have you with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.